And thank you so much for joining our Workbench Masterclass today. Glad you all enjoyed some throwback Blink. My name is Jessica Lynn. I'm a co-founder and general partner at Workbench. We are an enterprise software VC fund based here in New York City, and we invest in seed companies throughout the country, leading $3 to $6 million seed rounds. Now, the number one thing we work on with our founders is enterprise sales and go-to-market all day, every day. And why we launched this Enterprise Operator Masterclass series with operators from the fastest growing enterprise software companies sharing their top playbook pages with us. And, one of the most common challenges we hear from our founders building, especially open source developer companies, is how to create an authentic two-way community that eventually allows us to convert users to teams and then ultimately to commercial customers. So when I met Gonto and heard about his experiences, I knew we needed to have him speak. So Gonto was previously the SVP of Marketing and Growth at Auth0, where he grew the marketing team to 80 plus people and was responsible for doubling Auth0's ARR annually. In 2018 and 19, the marketing team was responsible for 82% of the revenue generated. He is now general partner and B2B growth advisor at HyperGrowth Partners, where they work with fast growth companies like Airbyte, Vercel, and many more. And from these experiences and lessons, he will be sharing with us the 5 experiments for you to find a winning developer acquisition strategy. We will leave plenty of time for a Q&A throughout, so throw your questions into the chat. And we'll also be recording the session and have a recap blog post. And so with that, please join me in welcoming Gonto.
Thank you for inviting. Let me share my screen. And as you said, we're going to be talking about a few experiments of things that we've done to have a winning developer acquisition strategy. My name is Gontovnikas, but everybody calls me Gonto. I just have only one slide about myself. I'm an engineer by trade, so I've always been an engineer. I worked as an engineer for 8 years, like programmer, software architect at different roles, and then moved into the dark side, as I say, and doing marketing, mostly working with developer tools since it's easier to understand an engineer being an engineer. As you mentioned, I was at Auth0 from inception, so from $0 of revenue up to 160 mil in ARR, which is the moment that we got sold to Okta. And right now, I started HyperGrowth Partners with Guillaume Cavain. He was the VP Marketing at Segment and Drift. And we help companies that have found product market fit achieve hypergrowth in exchange of equity. Some customers are Vercel, Ramp, Airbyte. We actually use some of the examples from some of our customers and some examples from Auth0 as well. But as I said, today we're going to talk about what are a few tips and a few things that you can do to target developers with your acquisition strategy. We'll focus on 5. Each of them will try to make it as tactical as possible. I'll stop after each tip to see if there's any questions on that particular one so that we can make it a little bit more interactive. Tip number 1. And this is actually the first tip because I think it's very important for anything else that you will do in here, which is always start with research. I think that there's a lot of marketing executives that I see that when they join a company, they always do what worked in their previous job, assuming that what works in the previous job will actually work on this one. For example, if we're to target developers, they did ads on Twitter and it worked perfectly. They're going to be, no, we need to do ads on Twitter. That's what works for developers. And I think what they don't realize is that developers are not the same. It's not the same to target a front-end engineer than to a back-end engineer, or even a front-end engineer from a startup to an enterprise, or even somebody who is in an SRE, in a site reliability engineer platform, or somebody who is a DevOps or DevSecOps. So thinking that everything that worked from the past will work now, I think is a mistake, because as we just talked about, all developers are not the same. They each have unique things that they care about, and even more, the things change depending on the problem space. So based off of that, I always think it's very important to start with research. But this research is not the same research that you would do from product, because if you're doing product research, you're basically talking about the product. When you're thinking about marketing and how to tap into developers, it's more of a habits research. I'm a big believer that if you want developers to visit your site, you can't make developers do things that they typically don't do. What you should be doing instead is actually understanding what they do on their day-to-days and just show up consistently and multiple times on the things that they do in their day-to-day. So I'll give you an example of some habits research that we've done in the past. First of all, I think that the number one most important thing is to interview developers that are part of your target market. So as I said, if they're front-end engineers, you look for front-end engineers. And you can look for them on Twitter or LinkedIn or anywhere. A lot of times I use LinkedIn, honestly, because I will look if it's a startup or if a company or something like that and send them an email. And the email is typically about that we'll offer them some money, maybe $50, $100 for 20 minutes of their time. And then I promise them that we're going to talk about their habits and I will not mention our product nor try to sell them our product. Most developers don't want to do research because they think they're going to be, they're going to talk to me about their product and what they do all the time. And I think if you tell them that that's not going to be the case, it's a very big difference. So once they agree on doing it, these are the type of questions that I would ask them. Like, this is something, for example, we did at Auth0. Auth0 is a B2B SaaS for authentication. So the questions were, how do you learn more about authentication? Where do you learn that? What's interesting? Are you interested in learning about something in particular about authentication? Who do you follow? Like, are there people that you look what they say? Do you follow them on Twitter, on LinkedIn? Do you read their blog? Do you follow their Substack? What do you do? Are you part of any community? How do you participate in those communities? Are they online? Are they offline? Have you used something for authentication in the past? When? How? What do you do during your day? When do you use the computer? When do you use the mobile phone? What apps do you use? And if you see, all of these questions are based on what they do on their day-to-day. And once you start doing maybe 8, 9, 10 interviews, you see that everybody will start saying the same thing. So I'll give you 2 examples on Auth0 and Rev, which is one of our HyperGrowth customers, on how different this was. For Auth0, when we did this interview, our biggest competitor back then was Okta. And Okta was writing for developers a lot of content that was focused on single sign-on or refresh tokens, which are 2 very technical terms about what authentication is, and we're trying to explain people about it. However, when we did these interviews, what we learned was that developers, first of all, the first thing that they told us was they do not want to learn about authentication because they think authentication is boring as shit. And they would only care about authentication when their boss told them to implement them or their team needed to implement it. And okay, we're going to implement it. And they got stuck, for example, because they got an error or they looked for an open source specifics. When we asked them if they're interested in learning something in particular, they said no. We asked if they followed someone in particular about authentication. They also said no, but they did follow people. Most of them were front-end engineers that were working on each of the frameworks. So if it was an Angular engineer, they would follow an Angular Twitter core committer or framework creator. Same for React, same for Next.js, same for a lot of the frameworks. They mentioned to us some of the communities that they were part of. And they talked about how they use Adblock all day long. They use Twitter to learn and stuff like that. So based off of this, for example, something that we realized is that the strategy that Okta had on creating content on single sign-on and refresh tokens made no sense. And part of our strategy here were 2 things. One is engineers, like they told us that they would search for when they got an error and they were implementing it. So something that we did was we tried to implement authentication with all of the potential frameworks that existed and that we tried out. And for each of them, when we got an error, we actually created a landing page. So we had landing pages that were like, hey, you got this error, this is how you solve it. And we had instructions on how to solve it. And then an aside mentioning, if you don't want to implement this by yourself, or if you want to add more advanced features like multi-factor authentication or something like that, you can just go and use it yourself. And we tried to get a lot of hits on something like that, because again, developers were searching for some of this content. Another thing we did was we went over GitHub projects around authentication, and we sponsored them. So we gave them money in exchange for having in the README something like, if you don't want to implement authentication yourself, go check out OutZero. Again, part of their workflow, part of the things they were doing. So doing this research was something that was very interesting to us. I'll give a few more examples on how you are part of this workflow for these people. However, Rev is another company that we help. Rev does speech to text. So if you send them like a video with speech, they will give you text. They used to do it manually, but they recently shipped a new service called Rev.ai that basically uses AI to do this transcription, and it's more accurate than like Google or some of the other services. So when we talked to engineers about speech-to-text AI and what it was doing, it was actually very different what we learned, because what we learned here was that engineers who were focused on using AI platforms were very interested in AI, and they were very interested in learning what new things were there. They were also participating in websites like Kaggle. Kaggle is like a website from Google where you can do competitions on implementing AI algorithm. And based on what they told us with that, what was very interesting is that in their case, the strategy had to be different. It wasn't about errors or something they would Google. We actually could create more thought leadership content on how did we implement Rev AI platform. We thought of the idea of talking about like experiments that we did from how to improve the AI algorithm and how some of them failed, to share that with developers because they cared about that. So in the end, the strategy, even though they were all engineers, was not the same, because the front-end engineer in Rev authentication doesn't care as much about authentication as a back-end engineer who's working on AI and is looking into AI platforms to implement. So main tip here is do the habits research to better understand where your users are and what they do, so that then based off of that, you can start thinking about how to apply some of these techniques and some of the things. The idea is that once they give you also some of the feedback on the habits research, you can pick what parts of marketing to double down on, because it's not always ads that will work or content or something specific, but based on the answers and based on where they are at, you'll be able to pick on, should I focus on Twitter? Should I focus on LinkedIn? Should I focus on any given specific community? Should I focus on writing content? What type of content? Is it thought leadership or more like how-to guides? And once you do that, you can start trying things as experiments and see which one works and which one don't, which are some of the ones that we'll talk now in a second as well. Before I move into the second tip, any questions so far on this one?
There is one question, which is, how do you reach out to developers to ask them to be a research subject?
So typically what I do is there's three options, I would say. Number one is I go in LinkedIn and look for them and just send an email. But in the subject title, I use a lot of emojis. And I try to make it clear in the subject that I'm doing habits research and I will not sell them anything or talk about the product. And once they see you're offering them money, a lot of them will say yes. Other things that I've done is I've actually used ads. I've done ads on Twitter, which they mostly don't block because they are using the app, and they will if they are interested basically in talking to us, they reach out based on the ad and will filter the ones that make sense or don't make sense to us. Finally, when there's some people in the company that have a lot of followers on Twitter, we've had them tweet about this to then filter out which of those make sense or didn't make sense for us to interview and to do the research.
Awesome, super helpful.
Anything else on tip number one?
Here's one. Aside from the usual tools like LinkedIn, anything else you can recommend to do this type of research?
I don't think you need it. Like, I think it's LinkedIn or Twitter. Like, I honestly haven't done anything else more than that. And then we pay them like in Amazon gift cards typically or something like that. Other things, only other thing I can recommend that I've done is go to conferences. Like, if you have a target market of developers that go to a specific type of conference. For example, if your customers use the Jamstack, maybe you go to the Jamstack conference and you just go there and walk and just ask people questions when they are in that conference. That could be another way to find a lot of people who are similar and alike in one space that you can just talk to them and ask.
Awesome. Yeah, I think you can keep going. We'll kind of respond to the rest as you go on.
Awesome. Tip number 2 is focus on the developer workflow, and we'll double down here on these errors and a few other examples that I mentioned in the past. Part of this research will give you ideas on what is the developer workflow. And if you're doing a developer tool, basically your product will interact with the developer at a certain point in time. Like some of them will be when the developer is doing testing. Some will be when the developer is doing deployments. Others will be when the developer is like starting to think about an idea and doing it. Others will be when they're implementing something. Others will be when they're doing bug fixing. But thinking about what part of the developer workflow the developer interacts with the product will give you a lot of ideas on how to market with them. Because if you show up in that workflow as part of the time they are doing that, the conversion, I think, will be a lot higher. I'll give you these 2 examples on Auth0 web pages, the GitHub sponsorship that I mentioned, and I'll do one more on specific searches that they were doing. For Auth0, as I said before, something that was interesting was that developers only searched for us when they got stuck. So doing error pages was a big success for us. We ended up implementing something like 50 to 100 error pages, which basically helped them get unblocked and then help them out. And in that case, we built trust with them because, oh, Auth0 helped me unblock this error without using Auth0. We actually helped them just fix it. And then they offered us help if we want something else. So it was a soft sell as part of their workflow. Again, another one that I mentioned was when they are thinking out authentication, at some point in time, they will look into GitHub to see if there's something open source that they can just use instead of building it from the ground. If you can sponsor some of those GitHub projects, then what will happen is when they go to the GitHub page, they will be, oh, like I can implement it with this open source and it's maybe a lot of work, but they are recommending that I use another platform if I want to pay and not implement it myself. So maybe I can do that. Another thing that was interesting here with Auth0 was a lot of developers told us that they were using very specific search phrases. For example, if you think about it, a developer might want to have users implement authentication on Next.js with Active Directory. Active Directory is like the Windows users, or Next.js with Twitter, or React with Twitter. And when we talked to developers, all told us that they use the same searches. It was authenticate React with Active Directory, authenticate. So based on that idea, what we ended up doing is we need to be part of this workflow. Like the workflow of the developer is they search for this exact phrase because they want something very specific, and they will start with very specific results instead of a broad search. So based off of that, let me change my share. We ended up building a set of automated pages that we call the authenticate pages. And the idea of this is something that you can see, which basically shows all of the different authentication platforms that Auth0 could provide. And we had specific landing pages for each of the intersections. This is not in the website anymore, so I'm using the web archive. But for example, if somebody wanted to implement like React with Active Directory, we actually had a specific landing page that was for this intersection. And we had the same for all other intersections. So let me actually, instead of React with Active Directory, let's say that they wanted to do React with Facebook. So you can see 2 at the same time. And having this specific URL that was authenticate React with Facebook made it so that when the developers use that exact line to search, they would land on each of the exact pages that we created. And each page talked basically about how to add it in the dashboard, how to implement it, and then some stuff about us. It wasn't something very unique, but they got here, they were interested, and then maybe they came to our blog, or they went to some other page, to start learning more about how this was working out. On Facebook, if this page loads, it was exactly the same. The idea is it's authenticate React with Facebook instead of with Active Directory, and gives them the exact instructions on what to do. With this, we actually created 12,000 landing pages because we had one landing page for each intersection of technology or framework and way of logging in. And each of them didn't bring us a lot of signups. Maybe they brought us 0.5 signups. But if you have 12,000, that's a lot of signups every month. This one is like React with Facebook. On this one, for example, basically what it does is it extracts the code that it can from the docs automatically, and then it shows a picture on how you basically add a social connection like Facebook. And all look exactly the same, all look exactly like this. And still, it was a bit of information, they saw a bit of code, and it was the exact search that they would do. Let me change my share again. Screen share. So again, all of these examples that I just showed you were we showed up as part of the developer workflow based on the interviews that we did. Every time they had an interaction with authentication, in this case, in the product, we were showing up. That was the main idea of how we thought about this. I'll move to the tip number 3. Before that, any questions on tip number 2?
I think you're good to keep going.
Awesome. Tip number 3. To convert developers, you need to add value to them. This is something that I'm a big believer. Like, a lot of times, it's hard to get developers and nudge them to pay. I've seen a lot of startups that get a lot of traction and developers that sign up, they use the free plan, and they try it out, but then they don't want to pay. So what a lot of startups will do is they will bring a sales team, they will bring SDRs to see if they can convert them. An SDR, as you probably know, is like a software development representative. It's basically a junior salesperson, a junior AE. And what most companies do without success is once somebody has signed up to the product after maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks, they'll contact them and they'll be asking like, hey, I'm blah, blah, blah from sales. I saw you're using the product. Would you like to talk to us and engage? And developers, I always think that they have what I call a very high bullshit detector. And when they feel that somebody is trying to sell to them or somebody is trying to convince them to pay who doesn't understand them, like an SDR, that's something that a lot of times it doesn't work. This is actually a problem that we had at Auth0 and we could not solve. We couldn't find a way to get the signups to convert by getting sales. At Auth0, the only solution we found was just wait until they come and click in talk to sales. But with Vercel, we actually found another solution that works really, really well. What is the difference on what we found with Vercel? Number one, something that we realized is that if the SDRs are technical, they have a lot more response. So something we tried at Vercel, Vercel, for those that don't know, is a deployment platform that helps you basically deploy your websites on Edge, which is basically really fast, very developer friendly. They were getting a lot of signups, but again, not all of them were converting. So we actually did an experiment with Vercel. I'll go into this playbook example in a second. But with Vercel, what the experiment that we did was, okay, SDRs are not working. What if we get an engineer to contact them? We know that an engineer contacting them to sell was very expensive, but at least we could give it a try. So what we did was we got 1 or 2 junior support engineers, and we got them to basically act as sales. We taught them a bit about how to do sales. And then what they did was they actually started contacting these signups that were coming. And when they contacted these signups that were coming, they were trying to focus on not on getting them to pay, but actually on getting them to be successful. So the questions were more around, were you able to deploy your app in Vercel? Or they saw that like, hey, I saw your app is not deployed because there was a build fail. Can I help you with that? And once they saw the other person was technical, in this case, an engineer, and they wanted to help out, they engaged, they got the help on basically that they needed. And then after that, the support engineer basically told them something around, hey, now your app is live. There's other features that might be useful from you, like from Vercel to you, like this feature, this feature, this feature. If you're interested in talking about them and potentially see if they work out, just let me know. And they had a lot of conversion with that. So it worked pretty well. But having a junior engineer do this was kind of expensive. So we then did a second try of an experiment with something that was different. What we tried was, what if we hire somebody that is technical, but not an engineer? Could they have a similar reaction if we explain to them how to use the product and what things to talk about? But at the same time, if we can find somebody technical who has a bit of sales skills, might be easier. So what we ended up doing was hiring people that worked on an Apple Genius Bar or a Geek Squad on Best Buy. Those people were technical enough because they were basically helping install software or configure an iPhone or a Mac, or helping understand if something was not working on the computer that they bought. They weren't an engineer, but they also knew a bit of how to sell and how to talk to others. So we gave that a try, and it was a complete success, because in those cases, they are cheaper than an engineer, they are still technical, and with some training, they could speak similar to a one-on-one to an engineer in a way that maybe an SDR couldn't, because they weren't technical enough. Now, this team is called product advocates. Why they're called product advocates? Because SDRs is a very sales name, and developers don't want to talk to them, but they want to talk to a product advocate. So this team is basically, this Vercel product advocates is their inbound SDR team. The inbound SDR team is called product advocates, and they are all of these technical people. So now coming back to the playbook, what is the playbook then? Number one, these SDRs that talk to engineers when you're trying to convert them to a paid plan after they sign up should be technical. That doesn't mean they have to be engineers, but it does mean they have to be technical enough to be able to talk to them one-on-one, and they should have a name that shows they're more technical, like in Vercel's case, product advocate, but it could be something different as well. Rule number two is they should first be focused on implementation success. So it's not about trying to get them to pay. In the beginning, it's around have they deployed the application? Have they implemented successfully what they had? And if you have information on things that they got stuck, and you give them that information even before they ask, like for example, your build failed because of X, Y, and Z, I can help you with that. Are you interested? If you do something like that, it's even more likely that they're going to respond. And then after you give value to the developer, after you help them implement, after you taught them something, then you can focus on conversion. And then it's the moment where you can focus on, we have other features that are paid. If you're interested in using them, let me know. But it's still a very soft push. It's like, just FYI, and so you know, we have these features, you explain them, and softly you push them to see if they want to convert. This has been a success with Vercel. We're now trying it out with another company called Airbyte. They're for data engineers, and we'll see how it goes. But I think this was something that I haven't seen a lot of companies do that worked really well from a conversion standpoint for developer trials. I'll pause there for a second. Any questions before moving to tip number 4?
Yeah, here's a question, which is, how do product advocates differ from DevRel, right? Is a product advocate specific to the sales team versus DevRel and the marketing team? And even just your high-level thoughts on DevRel.
Yeah, so I see them honestly very, very differently. Like, I think the developer relations or developer advocates exist more as like to build a relationship with developers. Like in my mind, a developer advocate, of course, wants to help them be successful, but most of the time, I think a developer advocate is not focused only on signups and only on the product. They are focused on, if you're doing Vercel and it's a deployment platform, maybe you don't talk about Vercel, but you talk about how to work on Edge, how to have apps that run really fast. how to think about apps that are global and what they mean. And you create content about that, you create videos, you go to conferences, you engage with other influencers. The idea of, in my mind, with a developer advocate, and we'll talk about this in the tip number 5, is that they can build a relationship with influencers, so then they become known, and by like transitively, the company also becomes known. And that's their main focus. It's like, how can they start to create awareness? These product advocates, I see them more as a junior salesperson who are still trying to add some value and help the developer implement something, but with the objective of conversion. And they are actually paid on conversion, similar to a sales rep. They get quotas, half their salary is quotas, and depending on how many of them they convert into meetings with an AE, they will get more. So I see them as a technical version of an SDR, rather than somebody who can create respect or authority among other developers. And as I said, we'll talk a bit more about that on the tip number 5.
Awesome. Great.
Anything else on this one?
I think we're good on this one, and we'll circle back to some others.
Awesome. Tip number 4. Content products are the new content marketing. Every company now, if it's a developer company, they have a blog. Everybody is doing a blog. Everybody is trying to help others with interesting content. Everybody is trying to target SEO keywords that everybody is looking for. And maybe a few years ago, this wasn't the case. So you could like be great and get a lot of signups and money just by doing developer content. But now I think doing developer content is not enough, because every company is doing the same. And if you do the same as all of the other companies, it's a very tough competition for you to win. So you should think about how to differentiate, how to do something different that maybe is still content related, but it's not the same as all of the other companies do. Something that you should also consider and think about is that getting people to sign up to your service, on average, typically requires between 4 and 6 touch points. What does that mean? That means a developer comes to your website and reads a blog, and they're like, I'm not gonna sign up. Then they come back and they read an ebook. Then they come back and they see that you have like an online meetup, and they join the online meetup. Then they see you in a conference that you have a booth. Then they go back to another blog post and they're like, okay, I'm gonna sign up and try this service out because I've come here so many times. They've helped me with the blog. I saw them on the conference. I like the online talk, and I end up converting. So if you think that conversions in general require so many touch points, it's because it's hard to create this trust from people. And trust comes from them coming over and over to you, where you're adding value to these developers. So if you think about that, a good way to do this would be content products. We'll talk about what a content product is after I show you actually an example of a content product. Let me show you my screen again. This is a content product that we created at Auth0. I'll show you a few others from other companies as well. And this one is called jwt.io. When you're doing authentication, there's a token that is called JSON Web Tokens. Each of these tokens is basically what you need to use to authenticate. And when you're using that to authenticate, basically, a lot of people will need to debug it. What does it mean? This token that is on the left actually has some content inside, but by default, you cannot see it. So in this case, what we're doing is we're showing them what is the content of the token, and if they want to change the content, they can actually easily change it in here, and it will redo the token with a given secret. Doesn't exactly matter what it is, but the important thing is that the developers who are implementing authentication, whether it's with Auth0 or not, will need to use and understand JSON Web Tokens, and they will need to understand why it's working or why it's not working. At Auth0, some of our most popular blog posts were actually related to JSON Web Tokens. So, and we had a lot of people who were coming back to read some of those blog posts. So what we thought about was, how can we create something that is related to JSON Web Tokens that adds value to a developer, but something that a developer would use at least weekly. And if it's more, better. Because again, if you remember what I said before, where a conversion requires 4 to 6 touch points, if you can create a tool or something that a developer will come back weekly, that means that they will constantly see the tool and constantly see that it's basically built by your company. And eventually, without needing to create more blog posts, they will convert, meaning they will sign up to Auxilio in this case to try it out. Mostly because in this case, they just keep on using the tool over and over and over. And they're gonna think, if this tool is fantastic, and I always see this brand, maybe I should check it out. This JWT.io is what I call a content product. Why? Because it is a product. It's something, it's a tool, it's something you can use, but we are using it similar to content as a way of people to discover and become aware of a platform. There's another one from Algolia that's called Dog Search, which was also fantastic. This was their content product. What was it? It's a way where you can have search implemented for open source projects. So if you come here and you apply and you get access, basically you can build for free documentation search for your open source framework. Frameworks are using Babel, TypeScript, React. There's a bunch of them. And Algolia became extremely known thanks to this, because if you go to any of these websites and you see their docs, you will see that when they are searching in here, it says search by Algolia. And that's a must. They force you to do this. So again, what did they do? They're part of the developer blog workflow with a content product. So it's something that now, every time they go to any open source framework that they use and they start searching for something, they'll see Algolia, 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 Algolia. And eventually, based on seeing this so much time, they will connect. Another one that I think is perfect is Twilio Quest. Twilio Quest is a game that Twilio created that explains to you how to send SMS, how to send messages, how to think about communication with something that looks like a very old school game. It looks like a 90s game that you used to play on your Super Nintendo. So it's something that's fun to try out, but they are teaching you about this. And because it's a course that basically takes multiple examples and multiple ways to implement, it's something that maybe takes you 3 months to finish. So then every time you use it, every time you come back, again, you see that it's made by Twilio, you remember that, and eventually you will convert. All of these platforms, all of these products that were created with a marketing focus in mind, and they are used similar to content, but it's content that is interactive and that people come back to it on and on and on. Let me share again the slides. So then, what makes a content product? Like, what are the main rules of creating a content product? Number one, that of course, this tool that you're creating for marketing purposes have the same target market as whatever you are building for your platform. In the case of Auxilio, JLD.io was used by front-end engineers who were using some authentication platform. Those were the ones that we wanted them to use Auxilio. It has to be connected to your product core. It has to be something that is somehow related to what you do. Let's talk about Algolia Dog Search in this case. They provided free dog search for open source product in exchange of having that made by Algolia. It's connected to their core. It's basically what they do. They do search, so you will see search when it's there. Rule number 3, it's interactive. It's something where they don't just read or they don't just look. It's something that people can use, and they use it. And by using it, they actually remember about it more. Because if it's something that they use, they will remember about it more because it's part of their workflow. It's not just something that they read. It's, as I said, useful at least weekly. Big believer of this as well. It's something that if you want to get people to convert, they have to see it on and on and on and on. So they always remember your brand and how you're adding value to them with this tool. So eventually they convert and sign up. And ideally, it has its own branding. I've seen both cases in here where have some their own branding, some do not. But for example, in Auxilio's case, JLD.io is a different website and it has its own branding, but it's related to Auxilio's branding. So if you see it, it's similar, but not the same. And that, I think, makes the developer want to use it more because they don't feel they are being tricked by somebody to use it on their website or something like that. This last one, I don't think it's mandatory. I've seen other tools like the Optimizely A/B testing calculator, which is actually a fantastic tool, and it's in their main website and it still works. But I think all of the other rules, the first four, same target market, connected to your product core, interactive, and useful at least weekly, are very, very important when you create a content product. I'll pause there for a second. Any questions on this one?
I mean, these are such cool examples, and I'm so glad you pulled them up so we could see it. Here's a question, which is, for these microsites, who runs and builds it? Is it the product team? Is it purely the marketing team?
On all of these companies that I mentioned, it's always done by the marketing team. And I would say that in most cases, it's built by the developer relations or developer advocacy team. How I've seen this built is the developer relations team build these platforms, but then a growth team will basically test on it. So the default version is ideated and created by Vercel, but then like thinking about, okay, should we add a link to the website, so Auxilia's website, where, how many times, in what color, in what order, how to think about it? It's something that then growth ongoingly tests on top of this going forward.
Awesome. And a follow-up question is that this content product also needs go-to-market, right? To get as many eyes and views out there. Do you have any tips specifically for the content products go-to-market?
Yes, for the content products go-to-market, the main way that I've seen this work is twofold. One is you use it in all of the conferences you go to speak. Like if you have a DevRel team, your DevRel team should be using your content product in all of the talks that they give, in the videos that they create, etc. So they show how it works and what it's doing, basically. Number one is some of them will have an automatic network effect. So for example, if you use the Algolia one, if you're using Tailscale, as I just showed you, or React, you'll see that it says powered by Algolia. So if somebody sees that, they're like, oh, what is it? You click there and you see that you can implement it in your own website. You implement it and then somebody else will see yours. So you get to that viral loop that is also very useful. And last but not least, I do think that in a lot of these content products, you also create some content. Like for example, JRT.io has an introduction to JSON Web Token and ebook. Why? Just because if people Google something around it, they find the website and they get to it. But if you ask me what's the most important one of all of those, I think it's around getting your DevRel team to continually use and showcase this.
Awesome. Thank you.
I have one last one, but we have 13 minutes left. Do we want to do questions instead of the last one, or do we want to do the last one?
I think let's get through the last one, and we'll squeeze in questions after.
Perfect. So tip number 5, tap into existing communities versus building your own community. I think community building is a must focus for developer marketing. Every company that is focusing on developers, that is doing developer marketing, has to focus in community, because community is a key viral loop. The idea is that if somebody in the community likes it, they will mention it to somebody else, that some other person will come to your community, and then they will invite somebody else and invite somebody else. And it's this typical viral loop of community. Something that I think is interesting and important is that every company that I see now is trying to create their own community. And I think that that's a mistake. I think that creating your own community only makes sense in the beginning when you're open source. If you're bigger, of course, you should go ahead and do it. But when you're starting, I think it only makes sense when you're open source. Why? Because if you're open source and your open source framework is becoming known, a lot of people will want to talk about how to become experts on that open source, because it will help them find their next job. I'll give you an example on this one. Docker. If you remember Docker, Docker got very known by creating their own community. Back then, everybody was using Docker for deployments. And if you were an expert on Docker, it was more likely as an engineer, you could find a new job or something, or a new position, because you were an expert in that technology that is open source and that almost everybody was using. So in that case, you wanted to be part of a community around that. And that's exactly what Docker did. Docker did a fantastic strategy where they found local people, like they created a lot of local communities. They went into every state of the US, they went into Europe, and they looked for people who were Docker experts. They offered those Docker experts free swag. They offered to pay like food and drinks, etc. if they brought people who cared about Docker near them. And they started to do something like that. And what they got in return was they were called a meetup organizer of Docker Alabama, for example. And that was good for them because that's something they could put in their resume, they could put in their LinkedIn, and it would help them find a job because they were an expert in Docker. However, if your product is closed source, not that many people in the beginning will want to be an expert in what you do. I'll give you the example of Auth0. At Auth0, we weren't known in the beginning. So it's like, why? What would be great for an engineer to become an Auth0 expert? It's not like other companies were looking for that skill. So based off of that, it was harder for them to find a reason why they wanted to join an Auth0 community. There were some, but not many. Because of that, I'm a big believer that if you're a closed source community, you should tap into existing communities instead of creating your own. We'll go into this in a second after we talk about what it means to creating your own community. However, we think about it is to create your own community, you have to create, or you can create, this type of meetups ecosystem, these local communities that I'm talking about. Once you create these local communities, then you can start building a Discord or a Slack to host online conversations. Of course, you can start it before, but if you started with this local ecosystem of meetups, there's a lot of people that will bootstrap your online conversation from the beginning, and it will be interesting from the beginning. It's also important if you're going to host your own online conversations that you get some influencers, some known people in the community to participate there so they get others to come. This is how I would think about creating your own community. However, as I was saying, if you're closed source, maybe it makes more sense to tap into existing community. That's something that both Vercel and Auth0 have been doing. How I would think about this? For Auth0, for example, we were a big believer that front-end developers were the ones that were going to use authentication. So in that case, what we thought about is we need to tap into existing front-end communities. And what we always did was we vetted on one community that was established and one that was up and coming. An established community is a community where it's really hard to become a thought leader. But if you become one, then you get a lot of traction and there's a lot of people who will listen to what you do. In an up-and-coming community, it's much easier to become a thought leader because the community is small. But if you believe the community is going to grow, it's a really good bet that if it grows, then a lot of people will hear to you. In our case, in the beginning, this was a lot of years ago, our established community was Backbone.js and jQuery, and our up-and-coming was AngularJS. AngularJS was a framework by Google. Back then, it was version 0.4, so almost nobody was using it, but we thought it was going to be huge. So we wanted to become the experts in authentication for that community. So what did we do? We got our entire developer relations team to apply to every conference in the world about AngularJS. We didn't apply because of the attendees. We didn't care as much about the attendees as we cared about the speakers. We went to every conference in the world because the speakers of the Angular conferences were the core committers of Angular or the creators of the main frameworks. And if we went to every conference in the world, we would basically see them and meet them everywhere. Like we saw them maybe in US, then in Denmark, then in Norway. And by seeing them everywhere, thanks to the speaker dinner, you get to hang out with them, you drink some beers, you go out, and you build a relationship. Thanks to building a relationship, they start following you on Twitter, and you talk often with them. So then, when we started to create content around AngularJS and how to use it for authentication, in some cases with Auth0, in some others without Auth0, what we saw is that all of these references in the Angular world, again, the core committers of Angular and creators of other frameworks, saw the content that we created, because we shared it with them, because we had a relationship, and they started to share our content. So once they shared our content, then everybody on the Angular community who had questions about authentication came to Auth0, mostly because everybody that they followed from that community was tweeting our blogs there. So by doing that, we tapped into that existing community, and then when they grew, we were still the thought leaders. So everybody came to us for questions. We did the same with Next.js as soon as it showed up. We believed that Next.js was going to grow, so we did the exact same motion. Go to every conference, know the committers, build relationship, get them to share the content, you become a thought leader. With Vercel, we've now done the same with, of course, they started with Next.js because Vercel is the creator of Next.js, but we've recently done that with Svelte. Svelte is a new up-and-coming front-end framework that this year was picked in a survey from Stack Overflow as one of the ones that front-enders want to use the most. So our idea was, if we become thought leaders and we go to every conference in the world and we know the people who are in this space, then everybody, when they think about deployments and using Svelte, will come to Vercel. So again, in this case, I think it makes more sense to tap into existing communities. This means picking a niche, one that is established and one that is an up-and-coming bet, having the developer relations team go to conferences and build relationships and build empathy with these creators, participate, of course, in online conversations, and create content for each of those communities so it's shared by the influencers that we mentioned about. And that's it.
Gonto, you have dropped so much knowledge in this last hour. Thank you so much. I mean, that was so epic in terms of all your specific examples and all of your really creative war stories. And we covered a lot today. So if folks found this helpful, please tweet the #1 thing you found helpful. I actually dropped Gonto's Twitter in chat as well. And like I said, we will have the recording coming out shortly. And if you'd like to check out any other enterprise playbooks, we have a number of them here on the Workbench website. I think we should take one last question in the time that we have. This is an interesting one. What new companies do you think are on the rise that companies should attach them, or new communities are on the rise that companies should attach themselves to?
I think it depends on the space. Like for front end, for example, I'm a big believer of Svelte. I don't think it's still that big, but I think Svelte is going to become very, very used and well known as a platform in there. Then the question is, what does that mean for backend? What does it mean for like DevOps and stuff like that? I don't know as much, honestly, about like backend and DevSecOps, but I think the idea here is you do the research by following people on Twitter in each of the spaces. Like I try to always follow people. If I'm starting to work with a backend company, I follow people in the backend community to start looking at what they tweet about, what they're thinking about, what they're seeing, and you'll get ideas on what's coming by looking at what people are saying in that environment. Every time I have a new customer that I'm gonna help, I actually start a new Twitter account, and I try to follow people in that space to see what they are talking about, to pick what's a new potential new niche community.
Awesome. And Gonto, I know I saw you tweeting this week some other awesome kind of marketing war stories and lessons, like I said. Thank you so much for today. This was so epic. We're going to, like I said, send out the recording, so be sure to follow us and follow Gonto. And we are going to leave you all with some Blink 182 for the rest of your day to see you all out. So thank you again, Gonto.
Thank you very much for inviting.